Hey, what is going on everyone? My name is Anson and we're back with a brand new video. In this video, I'm going to be teaching you all the basics of React Redux. So React Redux is basically a state management library. And what that means is it takes care of managing your component's state. So in other words, let's say for example, in your React component, you'll typically use the use state hook in a function component, and you'll use that to define some state for your component, right? Instead of doing that at the component layer, you'll do that at the Redux store. Okay, and the reason why this has many advantages is because instead of having to let a component own a certain piece of state in your application, you let the Redux store manage it. And what that allows you to do is allows you to very easily grab that value anywhere in your application, as long as it's wrapped inside the Redux provider. So you can very easily share state across as many components as you need, and you can very easily update that state anywhere you want within the application. Again, like I said, as long as it's wrapped inside the Redux provider. So why is this good? The reason why this has many advantages is because as your application grows, you're going to come across a point where you might wonder, well, these 5 components need to share a similar piece of state, right? And maybe you might consider lifting up your state. So instead of defining your state, in a single component, maybe what you'll do is you'll define the state in a root component and then pass it down to, all 5 or more of those components as needed, right? And so a common example of this would be, let's say if you're building some kind of application that requires authentication and you want to display the user's details, right? Instead of having to refetch the data from the API, maybe you might store it somewhere, maybe like a React context, right? And then anywhere in the application, as long as it's wrapped inside that context, that context provider, you can query that data from the context, okay? And so it's similar to what context can do for you, but React Redux does a lot more that the context API normally won't do for you. Okay, now this video is not going to be focused on why you should use React Redux over context or why you should use context over Redux. We're not going to be comparing and contrasting because that's just completely off topic. This video is just intended to teach you how Redux works, specifically Redux Toolkit. Okay, so for those who are interested in learning Redux Toolkit, maybe you might need to learn this for a job. Because they use Redux Toolkit for their application, right? This is going to be geared towards those people who need to actually learn Redux Toolkit. And fun fact, even though there are lots of other state management libraries that are available, such as Zustin or MobX or Recoil, right? Redux Toolkit actually is the most popular state management library, and a lot of companies actually still very much use Redux itself. And I'm not saying that because I'm a Redux Toolkit fanboy. In fact, I personally don't really care. I just want to state that out because a lot of people tend to have like a distaste towards Redux, which I understand because Redux itself, the older version of Redux used to be extremely bloated and it was really annoying to set up. But I promise you, using Redux Toolkit will change your mind 100%. So enough talking, let's go ahead and get started with our React project. So the first thing that you should do is you should definitely install the Redux Dev Tools. This is a browser extension, so you can see that right up top over here. I have this extension, and it basically allows me to view the Redux store and all the actions that are happening to the Redux store. Okay, so definitely install this extension. I highly recommend it. It makes debugging your Redux store so much more easier. You can think of it like a debugger with a very nice user interface, and I'll show you how that works when we get to that. Okay, so I'll leave links in the description to the official Redux docs as well as the Redux Dev Tools GitHub, so you can read more about that. But I have a simple React project already set up. Now we are going to be using TypeScript for this tutorial, but do not worry. Even if you are only familiar with JavaScript, you'll still be able to follow along because all the stuff that we'll be doing is going to be very easy to understand. And in fact, it'll be a lot more easier for you because you don't have to worry about the type annotation. So don't worry, don't click away from the video. I promise you that you'll still be able to understand everything, even if you are not familiar with TypeScript. So I have my project already. I'm just going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code right over here. And you can see that I have my React app running on port 3000. But let's just go ahead and close out this terminal right over here. And let's just go ahead into our app.tsx component. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove all of this stuff right over here. I'm just going to remove this. And you don't have to do this, it's complete optional. Okay, right now I'm assuming that most of you probably have an existing project that you want to use Redux in, like I said, don't worry, you'll be able to do that. So let me just go ahead and very quickly, let me just set the background color to a dark color because I do not want to blind you all with such a bright background. So we'll do that very quickly. And let me just make sure all this is removed. All right, perfect. All right, awesome. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to install the appropriate libraries. So we need to install Redux Toolkit. Okay, Redux Toolkit right over here. Let me zoom in a little bit. Okay. So, like I said, we're using Redux Toolkit. It's different than the original Redux library, the original React Redux library. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do yarn add at redux.js/toolkit. Okay, so we'll install Redux Toolkit, and then we're going to go ahead and create a store, which is going to be very, very easy. Okay, so let's go into our application, and I'll go ahead and create a new folder. I'll call this store. And inside the store, I'll create an index.ts file. So now inside this index.ts file, I'll just simply configure our store. So we'll do export const, and we'll just call this variable store. And you're going to call configure store, and this is going to be a function that comes from the Redux.js Toolkit library. And from here, what you want to do is you basically just want to configure your store. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll set up our reducers, which we currently don't have any. Okay, but we'll set them up inside this object. So basically what we'll do is we'll basically need to create some reducers, and we'll add the reducers as a key value pair over here. So for example, if I have some kind of user reducer, this will need to map to the reducer instance itself, which we don't have any yet, but don't worry. We'll do that very, very easily later. Okay, so once we are done with this, we can definitely go ahead and start creating our reducers. So what I like to do is I like to create individual folders that have my reducer as well as anything else such as Thunks or sagas, for example. So what I'll do is I'll create a new folder, and I'll create a user reducer. So let's go inside here, and I'll just call this user. And what we're going to do is we're going to name this user slice. And the reason why is because to create our reducers, we're going to do so using the create slice API. Okay, now in old Redux, this was done a lot differently. You had to create, different functions that had switch cases. Like I said, Redux Toolkit makes things so much more easier, and you'll see that. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and create what's called a slice. So we'll do export const user slice equals create slice, and this function is going to be it's supposed to be imported from the Redux Toolkit library. For some reason it's not auto importing it, so don't worry, I'll just manually import it. So let's do import create slice from Redux.js Toolkit. There we go. Okay, and so now what we're going to do for our slice is we need to give our slice a name. So we'll do name, and then we're going to call it user. Okay, and then we need to assign two more properties. So one, we need what's called initial state. So if you have used Redux before, this is very, very familiar for you. But for those who don't know what, or have never used Redux before, basically initial state is going to basically be like the default value of your store's value, right? It's pretty much, you can think of it like the default value of your component's state variable when you call use state. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a variable called initial state. Okay, and what we'll do is for the user, I'll make this user have different fields. So for example, what I'll do is I'll say maybe the user might have an ID of, let's say 1. Okay, and the user might also have a username. So we'll just call it Anson. Okay, and then we'll do something like maybe email. We'll just do anson@anson.com. Okay, now of course, if you're using TypeScript, what you want to do is you want to go ahead and create an interface. So export interface, and you'll just call this user state. Oops. And then what you'll do is you'll basically just define the key value pairs, or you'll define the key, and then you'll type annotate the key to be what its data type is supposed to be. So for example, we have ID, so we'll set this to be number, right? Typically, I would define the interface first and then type annotate the initial state object with it. But I decided to, do this first for those who are only using JavaScript. So that way it's less confusing. But username will be of type string and email will be of type string. And like I said, if you are only using JavaScript, you do not need to worry about this part right over here with the interface. But if you're using TypeScript, you want to define the interface, and then what you want to do is you want to go ahead and type annotate initial state. So we'll type annotate initial state as that. And of course, if you remove the email, it's going to give you an error, and it says that property email is missing. Okay, so now what we want to do next is we want to go ahead and set up reducers. Okay, and reducers are basically what you're going to be using to update the state. So for those who are new to Redux, basically a reducer is just a function that you're going to be calling in order to update the actual state itself. So let's say, for example, we want to update maybe the username or the email of the user, right? We'll need to use a reducer to do that, right? Because with the Redux store, you don't actually modify the store directly. You can't just like, reference the store and, reference the key value pair or the key, and then you just assign it to a new value. You don't do that in Redux, okay? You basically need to use a reducer, which acts like a middleman that will take care of updating the state in an immutable way. Now, another thing that I should also mention is that Redux Toolkit uses immer, right, underneath the hood. Immer is a library that takes care of updating values immutably in an immutable way. So for example, we can do stuff like, let's say for example, if we're working with arrays, right? We can, do, array.push, for example, if we wanted to, right? We can also just directly update the state and just change the values without having to, return like, the current state, and then like, using like a spreader operator to return the current state and then overriding a single property. You don't need to worry about that with Redux Toolkit. In the old Redux, you would need to, do all of that stuff. In Redux Toolkit, you don't need to worry about that. Okay, so for now, what I'll do is I'll create one single reducer, and I'll call this update username. Okay, and every single reducer function is going to take in, the state argument. So this is the actual current state itself. Okay, and then it's going to take in a second argument, which is the action, which is basically, you can think of the action like an object that contains the type of action that is happening, and also what's called the payload. And the payload itself is going to contain the information that you're going to be using to update the state. So for example, when we are going to update the username, the action payload object will contain the username that we're going to use to update the state. Okay, so for example, this reducer function, if I wanted to update the actual username, I would do state. So this is the current state, right? And then you can see that I can reference username, email, or ID. We're going to obviously only reference username. And I'm going to assign it to action.payload. Now, action.payload is of type any. And like I said, you only have to worry about this if you're using TypeScript. So if you want to properly type annotate your action payload, there is this generic type called payload action. Okay, so let me just import that from Redux JS Toolkit, and you can just pass in the type of the payload. So our payload is just going to be of type string, so I'll just pass in string. And now if you hover over this, you'll see that the payload type is going to be string. Okay, of course, if you wanted to, you can create a custom type and then just pass in that custom type in between these angle brackets. Okay, so that way TypeScript knows what data type action.payload is. But like I said, if you're only using JavaScript, you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so now that we've created our reducer, and now that you know what exactly a reducer is, like I said, it's just a function that is responsible for updating the state, and that's all it's responsible for. Okay, what we're gonna do is we need to export those reducers. So we can very easily do this because when you basically set up your reducers inside the slice itself, inside the create slice object, right over here, the user slice is going to have this actions property, and this is an object that contains all of the reducers that you have defined inside that reducers object right over here. So what we can do is we can just destructure update username like that, and this will basically just export update username, and so we can literally import this anywhere we want. Okay, so now the final thing that we have to do is just export the reducer. So we'll make this a default export. So we'll do user slice dot reducer. Okay, and now what we can do is we can just pass in this reducer as the value inside our reducer object, so inside the store. So we're going to go back to the inside the index.ts file, which is where we were configuring the store. And what I'll do is I'll define a property called user, and this will map to the user reducer import. So we're going to go ahead and do import user reducer from user, and we're going to pass in user slice. So this will import the default export right over here, the reducer itself. Okay. And so now what I can do is I can set the value of user to user reducer like this. Okay, so now Redux will know what exactly is our reducers. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to wrap our application inside the Redux Provider. Okay, now the Redux Provider is basically going to allow us to actually use the Redux's APIs, because if you don't have the provider itself, then it's going to throw an error, of course, because how else will the components know, what Redux store is being used. Okay, so we need to wrap our application inside a provider. So we need to actually install the React Redux package. So make sure you install React Redux. Okay, this is going to allow you to get the provider itself. So let's go into our code, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap it inside index.tsx. I'm going to go inside the main entry point of our application, index.tsx, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap it over here. So we'll do import provider, and then you can see that IntelliSense is telling us it's from React-Redux. So we'll do that, and I'll go ahead and also we need to import the store that we just created. So this store literally comes from the store folder right over here. We're literally importing this store, okay? And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and do provider, and we have to pass in the store like this. And we're going to go ahead and render the, we're going to go ahead and render the app like that. Okay? And now that we've wrapped our app with the provider, we can actually use the Redux's APIs. So let's go ahead and get started. So inside our app component, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and show you all how to query the store. I shouldn't say query. I should say use the store to get the data. Okay. So right now, if we look in our user slice, you can see that our initial state is ID1, username Anson, email Anson@Anson.com. Let's go ahead and get the initial state and display all of these values in our component. Okay. So what I'll do is this. I'll actually do this. I'll create a new folder called components, and I'll create a user component. So let's do this. User components. I'll just call it user, or I'll call it a profile card.tsx. Okay. Export const profile card, and then what we'll do is we'll return some tsx JSX. So inside profile card, what I want to do is I want to render out the user's ID, username, and email, the default state. Okay. So in order to get the data from the store, we need to use what's called a selector. And selectors are basically just used to select data from the store. That's really all it is. So to use a selector, what we want to do is we want to first declare a variable. We'll call this user slice, and then we'll use the use selector hook. And let me just go ahead and import that up top over here. Selector from Redux Toolkit. Let's see what's going on over here. Actually, you know what? I think it's from React Redux. Sorry about that. React Redux. There we go. Okay, so we'll use this use selector hook. And then what we need to do is we need to pass in a callback function. And this callback function takes in one argument, which is the state. Okay, and like I said, if you're using JavaScript, you don't need to worry about this next part. But we're going to type annotate state. And this is actually something that we need to also do if we're using TypeScript. Okay, we need to make sure we have the correct type annotations for our application's state. So what we can do is we can create a custom type, call it root state, and you basically want to assign it the value of return type of, and you want to reference store, and there's this property called get state, and this will literally give you the root state itself. So this will properly type annotate your entire state. Okay, you can see that when I hover over type, you can see that this is basically going to give you the user, which is the user state. That's the reducer that we have over there. Okay, now we also need to do one more custom type. This will be for the dispatch itself. So like I said, this is only, you only have to do this if you're using TypeScript. Okay, so we'll do type of store.dispatch. Okay, very, very simple. And like I said, if you're using JavaScript, you do not need to worry about this part. So now what we can do is we can type annotate our state to root state, and we can reference state.user. If you don't type annotate it, one, TypeScript will complain, and two, you will not get IntelliSense. Okay, so what this will do is this will literally return the entire user slice. Okay, now I didn't really explain exactly what a slice was, so let me explain what a slice is. So you have a Redux store, which is basically your container that holds all of the information about your application state. But inside the store, you actually have different slices, right? And each slice, you can think of a slice like a different part of your store itself, because obviously your store needs to, needs to be organized. It can contain many different, application state. So the way that we can organize that is by putting everything inside what's called a slice. So our user slice is basically just a part of our Redux store that contains all the relevant state to the user itself. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. It's literally just a piece of the Redux store, because you don't want to obviously get the entire Redux store in your application. If you need certain fields or data in your component, you want to get a single slice. Okay, so that's what we're doing here, is we're literally just getting the slice itself. And you can see that when I reference user slice, I can reference email, ID, and username. Okay, so let's do this. Let's go ahead and render out everything. So let's do user slice dot ID, and I'll just wrap this inside a span. So let's do that. Let's do span user slice dot username, and then we'll do span user slice dot email. And if I save, and then I'm going to go ahead and render out profile card. And let's go into our application now, and let's see what happens. So let's go over here. Let's refresh, and it's hard to see, but let me zoom in a little bit. Let me also just change the text color to a white color. You can see that right now it is rendering all the data from the Redux store. Okay, let me also just make sure I put this in its own div real quick, so that way it's easier to see. Okay, so we have the ID, the username, and the actual email itself. This is all the default state. The initial state is what we should call it. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that shows you how to actually get the data from the store itself. Now the next question is, how do we actually modify the store? How do we update our user state? Well, let me show you. So what I'll do next is I'll go ahead and create another component. I'll just call this user form.tsx. And this will just be a simple form component that will allow us to update every single value. So what I'll do is I'll return a form. Okay, and I'll have 3 fields. Well, actually, I'll have 2 fields. I'll have one for updating the username and one for updating the email. Okay, so we'll create a label. I'll just call this username, and then let's do username, and let's just go ahead and do inputs, type text ID username. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and create another one for email, and we'll just set the ID for this input to be email. Okay, so now we can see that, well, let's first go ahead and render out the user form component like that. Okay, and now we have our forms. We have username and email. Let me also add a button as well. And let me also just put these 2 input fields inside their own div. So let's do this. There we go. Okay, so now what I want to do is I basically want to input some text, and when I click save, it'll update the Redux store. So now the next question is, how exactly do we actually update the Redux store? Right, specifically the user slice. How do we update the username and email? Well, what we want to do is we want to basically dispatch an action. Okay, and dispatching an action basically allows us to tell Redux, hey, I want to update a part of the Redux store. Okay, and it's going to tell Redux what is going to be updated, and we're going to pass in the appropriate fields that we're going to want to update the store with. Okay, so in order to update the store, we're going to need to use something called the dispatch function. Okay, and the dispatch function is basically just used for dispatching actions. Basically, you can use the dispatch function to, tell Redux what's going on, basically. Okay, because like I said, we never actually directly reference the store, right? Everything is every part of Redux is separated into its own layer, if you want to think of it like that. So for example, we have our component. The component is supposed to dispatch actions. You can think of it like an event that is going on, right? And then it's going to receive that event, it's going to receive that dispatched action, and then it will call the reducer function, and the reducer function is going to take care of updating the state. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and declare a variable called dispatch, and we're going to call the use dispatch hook. And let's just go ahead and import that hook. So import use dispatch, and this should come from React Redux package. Okay. And we also want to make sure we annotate, and like I said, you only have to do this if you're using TypeScript. So annotate it with app dispatch like that. Okay, otherwise it'll complain about not knowing the correct type. So what I'll do is this. So there's two ways that we can handle this. One, we can actually update the store as we are typing. Okay, so you can see right over here we have this username over here, right? We have username right over here. And you can see that we have one reducer called update username. So what I'll do is actually, we're not going to use the save button yet, but what I'll do is, as I am changing the username, I'll update the store. So let's do on change, and we'll do pass in a callback function. So that's the event object. And as we are typing, we're going to dispatch actions. And so how do we dispatch actions? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to first import this this update username reducer. So we're going to go ahead and import that right over here. So update username, you can see that is going to be imported from the user slice file. And we'll call this, and all we got to do is just pass in the payload, which we know is of type string. So we'll just pass in e.target, the value, which will give us the value that the user is typing for the input field. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what happens. So I'm going to refresh the page, and you're going to see that inside our component, right, we have our username Anson. But watch what happens when I go ahead and type something else. If I type hello world, you can see that as I am typing, it is updating the store itself. So it basically is dispatching this update username action, and it's going to call this update username function right over here. And this reducer function is going to take care of updating the username field inside our state itself, inside the user state. Okay. Now let me go ahead and also open up the Redux Dev Tools. So I'll click on this extension, and I'll go ahead and open it up right over here. Okay. Now you can see what's going on. You can see that every single time we are dispatching an action, the Redux Dev Tools will show you what action is happening. So you can see that right over here. Let's just kind of like, let's see. Okay, so you can see that right over here, when we start over here, it dispatched update username, and you can see that the value of username is H. Then it goes to HJ, H, HE, HEL, HELL, HELLO. So every single time we are dispatching an action, you can see that the state is different after every single action. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some insight of what exactly you could use Redux Dev Tools for. You can use it to basically see what the current state is, which I think is a great tool in my opinion. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense. And let's go ahead and also create another reducer function. We'll call this update email state action payload action string, because we're only going to update the email only. And we'll do state.email equals action.payload. And we also want to make sure we export that reducer. You need to make sure you do that in order to actually import it. So whenever we type in the email field, we'll go ahead and update the email. So we'll do dispatch, update email, e.target.value. And let me just also tidy up this part over here. Let me just remove this. There we go. So now watch this. Let's go ahead and refresh. So you can see that we currently have our initial states values. If I type something over here, the email is going to change. If I type something username, that's going to change as well. And notice how the state is being changed from a different component. Okay, all of our state, all of our values from the Redux store is being rendered inside the profile card. Okay, and all those values are being changed from the user form, from a different component. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And of course, I can create another component. And let's say, for example, let's create like, just a random component. Let's just call this, let's call this user details.tsx. Right? Like I said, this is really good because if you have a lot of different components that need to share the same exact state, you can just always call the Redux store by calling the use selector hook to get the values that you need. So we'll do export const user details. Okay. And just do this h1 user details, and we'll literally do the same thing. We'll get the user slice, so it's called use selector, and we're gonna have to pass in our callback function, and we're gonna reference state.user. Okay, and let me just import use selector from React Redux, and what I can do is I can reference user slice dot username, and let me just go ahead and copy this a couple times. Actually, I'll do ID and email like this, and I'll go ahead and render out user details somewhere else. So I'll render it out over here. Okay, and let's refresh, and let's zoom out a little bit, and you can see as I'm updating, you can see that the values are changing everywhere. Well, I mean, first of all, they're not changing everywhere. Let me phrase that. They're changing in the Redux store, but every single component is using that value from the Redux store. So as we are updating the Redux store, the other components will also re-render as well with the new value in the Redux store. Okay, if I change email, you can see that both components, they're completely separate, right? The profile card and the user details component are siblings. You can think of it like that. They're siblings. And we don't need to worry about lifting the state up or prop drilling, right? We have all of our state defined in a single container, in a single source of truth. And anywhere in our application, doesn't matter how deeply nested the component is, right? It's actually going to be a lot better for the deeply nested components, because then instead of having to prop drill, down like 10 layers in the component hierarchy, the component just needs to call the use selector hook, select the slice from the Redux store, and then we can just get the values. Okay, and those components can also update the store, and that new value will reflect globally everywhere in your application. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can fetch data from some API server, and then you can take that data and store it inside the Redux store. Because so far we've only seen examples of how we can actually update the Redux store based on, just updating some values in the input field. But there comes situations where we need to take the data from some API and then store it in the Redux store and then use it on the front end. So how do we do that? Okay, well, I'll show you how to do that. So for this tutorial example, I'm going to use something called my JSON server, and this is just a simple API that you can use just for like fake data and stuff. So I'm just going to use this as an example, so that way I don't have to set up an entire API. So what we'll do is we'll query this posts endpoint. So we'll just take this URL and we'll make an HTTP GET request to it. Okay, and we'll return this. The API will return this array of 3 posts. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a brand new slice in our Redux store. Okay, so we will not touch the user slice anymore. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and just create a post slice. And I'll zoom in a little bit so you guys can see it a lot more easier. So we'll do the same exact thing. We'll create the interface, so we'll call this post state. Okay, whoops. And what we'll do is we want to store all the posts. So posts will be an array. And let's also type annotate our post as well. So it's just only going to consist of an ID and title. So I'll just create a custom type real quick. Export type post. And then what I'll do is I'll set the ID of type number and then title of type string. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and type annotate posts as an array of posts. Okay, and we'll also set another state variable. We'll call it loading. This will be of Boolean type. So this will be a status indicator of whether or not the posts are being fetched or not. Okay, so that way we can do whatever we want. We can display a spinner if we want to tell the user that it's still fetching data from the API server. Okay, so let's go ahead and now create the initial state object. So initial state, type annotated with post state interface, and then we'll go ahead and set post to an empty array. Loading will be set to false. Let's go ahead and now create the slice. So we'll call this posts. I really should have called it posts slice. Let me rename that real quick. To posts slice. There we go. And I'll call it posts state. Okay, so let's call create slice. And for the name, we'll just call it posts. Pass in the initial state object. And we'll set up some reducers in a second. We'll go ahead and now export any reducers that we have by destructuring it from post slice.actions. We don't have any reducers right now, but whenever we add a reducer inside this reducers object, we're going to have to export that from the actions, okay? But we need to also export the actual reducer that comes from post slice object, so we'll do export default post slice reducer. Okay, and all we got to do is just import this post slice default export into the index.ts file. So we'll do import posts reducer from let's see, it comes from, oh whoops, I put this inside the wrong folder. Let me just create a new folder, posts. There we go. Posts reducer from posts post slice, and then we'll do the same thing. Whoops. We will just go ahead and call this posts, and then posts reducer. There we go. All right, so now we have that set up. If I go into my browser, if I open up the Redux Dev Tools, if I were to show you right over here, you can see that we have our posts slice right over here in the tree. So now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and fetch the API. And for now, what we'll do is we'll just use Axios. We won't be using our RTK query. That'll be for another video, but Redux RTK query is basically Redux Toolkit query. And it's basically a way for you to actually fetch data. But we'll save that for a separate video. So for now, I'll just go ahead and set up our API calls with Axios. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and do yarn add Axios. And you can use whatever data fetching library you want, but I'll just use Axios just for demonstration. Let me just also install the types file as well. And then we'll run the React app again. And that should open up the React app. Okay. So what we'll do is we will go ahead and create an API call to that server right over here. So what I'll do is I'll create a new folder, I'll call it utils, and I'll create a file called api.ts. And what I'll do is I'll export, well first let's import Axios from Axios itself. And then what we'll do is we'll do axios.get, pass in the URL. And we don't really need any configs because there's no authentication required. We can just pass in the URL. And I'm also going to just export a function, call it get posts, which will return this response. And now we know that this response is an array of posts, and we've already created that type inside here, export type post. So let me also just take this and put it inside a file called types.ts, and all the code will be in a GitHub repository for you all, so don't worry. And let me just also import that. Okay, so let's type annotate this axios.get because it is generic, so we can just specify a pair of angle brackets and do post, and it's an array of posts. Okay, so this is an array of posts, so that way TypeScript knows that the Axios response is an array of posts. So when you reference the response.data object, it'll know that it's an array of posts because we type annotated it. And like I said, if you're using JavaScript, you don't have to worry about these type annotations, okay? You can just ignore what I'm doing with the type annotations if you're using JavaScript. So let's go ahead, and after we have created this function, we need to basically create a thunk. So that's what we're going to be using to fetch data asynchronously. So what I'll do is I'll create a new file and I'll call this posts thunk.ts. And I like to separate everything. So because we have our slice, we have our thunks, I like to keep them separate. So let's do export const. And you want to name your thunk something that is predictable, something that is self-explanatory. So for example, if you are fetching posts, right, we'll call this thunk fetch posts thunk. Or you can call it get posts thunk if you want. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and call create async thunk. And this is a function that's going to be imported from Redux Toolkit. Okay. And we want to call this function. And we want to basically pass in some parameters. So the first parameter is going to be the name of the thunk. So you can call this whatever you want. I personally like to call it the name that it belongs to, like the slice that it belongs to, so posts, and then slash, and then the action, so fetch, so post/fetch. And then the second parameter is going to be a callback function. And this callback function, the first argument is going to be any parameters. So if, let's say, for example, any IDs, any payload, whatever, right? The second parameter is going to be the thunk API. Okay, we'll talk more about this later. But if, let's say, for example, if you need to pass in any payloads, any parameters into the thunk, that's what the first parameter is for. If you're not, if you don't have any, then you can just ignore that, of course. You just do underscore and then thunk API like that. Okay, now we don't have any parameters that we'll need, so we'll just leave those two. We'll just ignore those two. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and call that function that we just created, get posts. Okay, so that's the Axios call. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and do get posts. Seems like it doesn't want to import, so we'll import that ourselves from go out to directories, utils API. There we go. And so we're going to call get posts, and we're going to go ahead and just return the call. We're going to return this function call. Okay, so basically what create async thunk really does is it basically just takes whatever asynchronous function call that you're making. I mean, typically they are going to be asynchronous function calls, right? Because the whole purpose of using a thunk is because you want to perform asynchronous side effects. Okay, and basically it'll wrap the function calls that you are making. It'll wrap the entire thing into a promise, or it'll actually wrap it into a thunk. And what you need to do is you need to go ahead and reference the fulfill, pending, or rejected properties to get the state of the thunk. So it's similar to when you're dealing with regular JavaScript promises, where you have three states of the promise. You have whether it's pending, whether it's fulfilled, whether it's rejected. The thunk itself, right, if I were to reference fetch post thunk, you can see that I have the fulfilled property over here, I have pending, and I have rejected. And these properties, basically, you can use these properties to handle cases of the thunk. Okay, if the thunk has fulfilled, that basically implies that everything that has happened in the thunk itself never errored out. If the thunk is in a rejected state, right? If the thunk is in a rejected state, that means something may have happened in the thunk that caused an error, so it caused that whole promise to reject, so the thunk will be in a rejected state. If the thunk is in a pending state, that means that it still is waiting for the promise to be fulfilled. Okay, so we're pretty much done over here. So now what we need to do is we need to actually dispatch this thunk in order for it to actually perform the asynchronous call to the API, because inside our thunk we're literally calling get post and we're returning this value. Now I'll write a simple console log and I'll just say inside fetch posts thunk, just so that you all can see what's going to happen. Okay, so here's what I'll do. I'll go into app.tsx and I'll go over here and I'll just do everything inside the app component because we already are heading towards an hour for this video, so I want to speed up a little bit. But what I'll do is I'll go over here and I'll just create an H1 that says posts, and I'll create a button, fetch posts. Okay, and so what I want to do is when I click on this button, I want to dispatch the thunk in action, right? That will basically call that thunk for us to actually fetch the data from the API. Okay, so what I'll do is first, let's go up top here. Let's do const. Let's get dispatch. So we're going to call use dispatch. Okay, and we're going to type annotate this with app dispatch. And what I'll do is I'll register a click event on the button, and I'll say when we click on this button, we will dispatch an action, and that action is going to be a thunk. So we're going to import this fetch post thunk, and we're going to pass it as an argument inside dispatch. So let's import fetch post thunk. There we go. And this is a function that needs to be called. And remember that our thunk does not take in any arguments. Okay. We could if we need any arguments, right? But for now we will not have any. And we'll go ahead and dispatch this action. So let's go over to our React app. Let's refresh. Let me open up the console. And now you'll see that if I click fetch posts, you're going to see it says inside fetch posts thunk. Okay. And you can see that there is an error. Don't worry about this right now. But you can see that it is dispatching that thunk, and it is inside the thunk itself. If I look at the network tab, you can see that a post request was made. It returned a 200, which means it was successful. Now, to fix this non-serializable value, well, first off, the reason why this is happening is because the data that you're fetching from the API is likely non-serializable. And part of Redux's core principles is that you shouldn't have non-serializable data in your state or your actions. Okay, but for now, what we'll do is we'll just disable this for now. Okay, and we can just do that by going inside where we are calling configure store. So inside my store folder, inside the index.ts file, inside the properties for configure store, there's this middleware property. Okay, and it's going to map to a function, and that function takes in one argument, which is the get default middleware function. And you can basically just call this right over here. So I'll show you. So get default middleware, and then you can just pass in serializable check, set that to false. And now when you click on fetch posts, it will not throw the error, and it will call posts. It will call the fake JSON server. Okay. All right. So now what we have to do is we have to take the data that has been fetched from the JSON server, and we need to take that data and we need to store it in the Redux store, so that way we can actually select it and render it to the DOM. Now, the only thing that we've done was we just fetched data, but we haven't done anything with it yet, and that's not quite useful. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that data and then store it in the Redux store. But how do we do that though? Right? How do we do that though? Well, as I mentioned earlier, remember that the thunk that we created has 3 states, right? If you reference fetch post thunk, it's going to have fulfilled, pending, and rejected, similar to a promise. Okay, you can kind of think of the thunk as a promise. Okay, and it has those 3 states. And so you can think, right, fulfilled state is obviously going to contain the data that was fetched from the API, right? The rejected state is going to contain an error that could happen if, let's say, for example, the API call, something happened with the API call, right? Whether it's the wrong endpoint or something went wrong, right? Or the server's not responding. And of course, the pending state could just mean that the server has not responded yet, or the promise has not been fulfilled yet. So those are the three cases that we can handle with our thunk. Okay, now the way we handle it is actually very, very easy in Redux Toolkit. So what we'll do is we'll go inside our post slice, and where we are creating our slice right over here, we can pass in an extra property called extra reducers. And this is going to map to a function. Okay, and that function is going to take in this builder object. And you can use this builder object to add cases. And you can basically just pass in action creators. Okay, so for example, what we can do is we can take this fetch post thunk. Okay, and let's import that. So import it up there, and we can pass in fulfilled. Okay, and this fulfilled property is of type async thunk fulfilled action creator. Okay, and basically what will happen is when that thunk has been fulfilled, right, it's going to go ahead and call this extra reducer. Okay, so the second argument is going to be a callback function that's going to look very similar to the reducer functions that we created for the user slice. It's going to take in the state and the action. So let's pass in a callback function, pass in the arguments for that callback function. And because we already type annotated our Axios API call, the action itself is going to already be type annotated. And you only have to worry about this if you're using TypeScript. Okay? And so before we do anything else, let me just go ahead and console log fetch posts thunk.fulfilled. And basically what's going to happen is when the thunk has fulfilled, it will literally just call this extra reducer. Okay, and we set this up by literally referencing builder, and we just add the case. So during the case when the thunk has been fulfilled, this reducer will be called. So let's see what happens. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and click that fetch post button, which will dispatch that fetch post thunk action. That thunk itself is going to call the API, and that API call will be successful. And because it's successful, that means it's not going to throw an error. Okay, so it can fulfill and resolve with the data. And when that happens, it's going to call this reducer function over here because we are in the fulfilled state. So let's go ahead. Let's go into the console. Let me just refresh. Let's click on fetch posts. So you see how right now it says inside fetch post thunk. So that's inside here. And then we call get posts. And then that promise resolves and it fulfills. And you can see that it now calls the fetch post thunk.fulfilled reducer case right over here. So that's what's happening right over here. So hopefully that makes sense. But let's go ahead and reference the action, right? Because how do we actually get the data from the API? Well, when the thunk has been fulfilled, right? Like I said before, it basically wraps whatever promise that whatever method that you're calling that returns a promise. So in our case, since get posts returns an Axios responsive type post array, right? This action payload, this payload action will contain a property called payload, right? And that payload, remember that payload type is going to be the Axios response, and that Axios response has the data property, which is going to be type annotated because we set that up already with the API call right over here. Post array. So .data is going to be an array of posts. So if I console log action.payload.data, you'll see when I click fetch posts, you're going to see that we have an array of 3 elements, and we have literally all the data from the API right now. Okay, we have all of the data from the API. And what we can do is we can update the state by referencing this state argument, right? And because Redux Toolkit is really simplified version of the old Redux, the old React Redux, right? We can actually just reference state.posts and just assign it to action.payload.data. If you're using the older versions of React Redux, right, before Redux Toolkit was a thing, you would have to actually do something like return and then .state, and then you'd have to, do something like post, something like that. You'd have to do something similar to that. But you don't have to do that anymore. Right? Thanks to Redux Toolkit, you can basically update your state in like a mutable way, but underneath the hood, the Redux Toolkit library uses immer, and immer basically wraps your state in a proxy, and it'll basically allow you to make mutable changes. How do I say? It'll basically allow you to make changes that look mutable, but in reality, it's actually updating it in an immutable way. If that makes sense. Okay, so you can just do this, and it'll update the state safely. And let's see what happens. So let's go ahead and let's refresh the page, and let me open up my Redux Dev Tools real quick. And if I click Fetch Posts, okay, you're going to see that in the Redux Dev Tools, you can see that first we are right now fetching the data, and it's in a pending state. Okay, post/fetch, and then /pending. That's the state. You can see that now after it goes from pending to fulfilled, you can see that if we look over here, let's click on pending. You can see that posts is currently, there's nothing there, right? But if I go into the fulfilled state, you can see that right now we actually have all of the data that is inside the Redux store, which is great. Okay, now let's go ahead and render out the data. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and use the selector hook to get the data from the store. So I'll go ahead and call this post slice, and then we'll do use selector, and we'll just get the state. So we'll pass in this callback function. The callback function takes in the state as an argument, and we can select the slice, so state.posts. Okay, and we're going to reference post slice, and we're going to reference posts, and we're going to call the map function. And for each post, we're just going to go ahead and render a div, and we'll do post.id. I'll do post.title. Let's do post.title. Let me do this. Let's do post.title, and then we'll do post.id. And let's just also set the key to post.id. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh. And right now you can see that if I click fetch posts, you can see that all of those posts are now in the DOM. Okay, they are being rendered. And of course, you could also do other stuff too. With the Thunks, you can handle the other cases as well. So we added this loading state. By default, it's set to false. Okay, so what I'll do is if loading is true, right? So let's do post slice dot loading. If it's true, we'll go ahead and render some text, and we'll say loading posts. Okay, and it might be hard to notice because this API call is going to happen really fast. But what we'll do is we'll just basically do this. So what we'll do is when the thunk is in pending state, so let's reference fetch post thunk dot pending state action. Okay. Whoops. Let me also do one more thing. We can also chain all of these add case calls like that. So we can do builder.add case. That's going to literally return the builder instance, so we can just call add case again, which is really nice. So when we're in the pending state, we'll just set loading to true. And when we have fulfilled, we'll set loading to false. And we can also set it when the thunk has rejected states. And we don't really need the action, so we'll just leave that alone. So we'll do state.loading equals false. Okay, but we'll also do one more thing. We'll also, before we actually dispatch the action to fetch the actual data, we'll dispatch our own reducer to actually set the state of loading. So I'll create another reducer up here. We'll do set loading. And I'll type annotate action as payload action boolean. And I'll do state.loading equals action.payload. We have to import payload action. There we go. And let's export set loading. So now before we dispatch fetch post thunk, what I'll do is I'll dispatch set loading first. Okay, and we don't have to dispatch it again because after the thunk has fulfilled or rejected, it will set loading to false. Okay, so let's try this out. So let's refresh. If I click fetch post, you can see it says loading posts. Okay, if I refresh, loading posts, post 1, post 2, post 3. So whenever we're in a loading state, it will go ahead and say loading posts. So hopefully this example gives you a better idea of how you can actually use Thunks to fetch data. And of course, if you wanted to make post requests or delete requests or patch requests or put requests or whatever type of HTTP request you want to make, it's the same thing, right? Same exact thing. The only difference is that, of course, you would want to probably pass in some arguments over here in the callback function over here. But that's very, very simple. So hopefully that makes sense. So that is going to be pretty much it for this Redux tutorial. Basically just wanted to cover all the common use cases that you'll use Redux for, as well as all of the basics. So we went over how to store data in the Redux store. We went over how to get the data from the Redux store. We also went over how we can update the Redux store. And we also went over how we can actually fetch data from an API, store it in the Redux store, and then use the useSelector hook to get that data and then render it. Okay, so if you understood pretty much most of the stuff in this video, then that's great. If you have any questions, I do have a Discord server. The link will be in the description, but feel free to join the Discord server. You can ask your questions over there. So that is going to be pretty much it for this video. Hopefully you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in my next episode. Peace out.